There's something almost laughable about the confidence of the Western media. They sit in glass towers thousands of miles away from India and tell 1.4 billion people what their own country is. They write editorials on India's democracy, India's society, India's freedom, as if India still needs validation from the West. Whether it's the BBC, CNN, or the New York Times, they all share one thing in common: an obsession with showing India in a negative light. And this isn't new. This bias has been visible for years. The New York Times even went as far as to claim that journalists in India are treated like terrorists. Just imagine that. The world's largest democracy, spoken of in the same breath as extremism. So the question is, why? Why this constant negativity toward India? Why does India's rise make them so uncomfortable? The first reason is simple. They cannot digest India's meteoric rise. For decades, these same editors and writers painted India as a helpless, chaotic, poverty-stricken land, a place where progress was impossible. And now that India stands as one of the fastest-growing major economies in the world, that old narrative no longer fits, and that bothers them. The second reason is ideological. Many of these media houses are run by so-called pseudo-liberals, people who wear the badge of freedom but refuse to see any nation that doesn't fit their Western template of morality and politics. For them, a confident India automatically becomes a problematic India. And the third reason, perhaps the most dangerous of all, is the influence of money and power. Today, some observers claim that powerful nations like China are using their vast economic influence to quietly shape global narratives, funding think tanks, media platforms, and social media campaigns that often present a pro-China or anti-India tone. They don't need to say it openly. They simply tilt the lens. A headline here, a missing fact there, and the world starts seeing a distorted version of the truth. This isn't new, but what's alarming is how information itself has become a weapon where perception matters more than fact. And in that war of narratives, India, despite being the world's largest democracy, often finds itself misrepresented or ignored. So when these international outlets question India, it's worth asking, is it journalism or jealousy? Is it reporting or resentment? Because every time India rises, the Western media seems to lose its balance. And here's where the irony becomes almost poetic. The same countries that have to drag their elections into courtrooms to decide who actually won are the ones giving India lectures on how to conduct a free and fair vote. Think about that. Nations that have spent months disputing their own election results, that have seen their capital stormed by mobs, now feel qualified to preach democracy to a billion people who line up under the scorching sun, patiently waiting to cast their vote, peacefully, proudly, and with faith in their system. Why? Because they're seeing an India that no longer fits into their carefully crafted image. An India that refuses to behave the way they expect it to. For centuries, these Western powers shaped the global order, and for nearly 300 years, they got used to deciding who mattered and who didn't. So now, when a confident India stands tall, when an independent India says no, it disturbs them. Old habits don't fade easily. The habit of influence, the habit of control, the habit of believing that only they know what's right for the world. And yes, they do try to influence us, politically, socially, ideologically. They wrap it in the language of freedom and human rights, but beneath it lies an old instinct to shape nations in their own image. That's why their media narratives sound so familiar, because what they truly want is an India led by people who think like them, look like them, and talk their language of selective morality. They aren't comfortable with the idea of a billion Indians choosing differently. They aren't comfortable with a democracy that doesn't take cues from them anymore. And when that happens, they push back, not with armies, but with articles, not with weapons, but with words. Editorials become their battlegrounds. Headlines become their ammunition. Let's be honest, many of these publications no longer even pretend to hide their bias. Some openly endorse political candidates in India. Some celebrate one party, criticize another, and even attempt to shape public opinion during elections. They've turned journalism into psychological warfare, a game of influence and perception. Because after all, If you've been running the world for 300 years, you've mastered the art of subtle domination. You don't need to invade nations anymore. You just need to control the narrative. But what they fail to understand is this. India doesn't need validation. Not anymore. Because here, in the heat of an Indian summer, millions still walk miles to vote. Here, governments change hands through ballots, not bullets. Here, people argue, debate, protest, and yet, in the end, they all come back to the same faith, that their democracy works. So let's return to the question, why this deep-rooted anti-India bias in Western media? The first reason is simple. They just can't digest India's rise. For decades, their newspapers and magazines painted India as a land of chaos and poverty, a country that would never stand on its own feet. And now when India launches satellites, builds highways, grows at record speed, and shapes global conversations, their old narrative collapses. It doesn't fit anymore. And that discomfort turns into criticism. The second reason is ideological. These media houses are run by people who call themselves liberal, but in truth, they only appreciate freedom when it looks like their version of it. They celebrate dissent everywhere, except when it comes from nations that refuse to follow their script. To them, a strong, self-reliant India is a problem, because it doesn't bow, it doesn't apologize, it doesn't seek approval. And the third, or perhaps the most strategic reason, is money. Today, Chinese influence runs deep across Western institutions, from think tanks to ad spaces, from policy boards to university funds. Beijing's money quietly fuels pro-China narratives while painting India as the disruptor. It's soft power warfare, and many in the Western press have fallen for it, willingly or otherwise. And when they're caught, they hide behind the same excuses. Editorial freedom, independent analysis, critical perspective. But let's look closer. Take The Economist, for example, a publication that recently ran a story about how Indian media covers diplomacy and even mentioned Indian journalists by name. They called Indian foreign policy coverage hyper-partisan, nationalistic, and ill-informed. Think about the irony. This is the same magazine that once endorsed the invasion of Iraq, that supported a war based on lies, that justified one of the biggest geopolitical blunders in modern history with the words, "Painful as it is, our vote is for war." And yet, they call Indian journalism ill-informed. When China joined the World Trade Organization in 1999, The Economist celebrated it, calling it a triumph for the rule of law, predicting that a strengthened judiciary in China would someday challenge the Communist Party itself. We all know how that turned out, but that's the pattern. When it's the West, it's strategic. When it's China, it's hopeful. But when it's India, it's suddenly dangerous, nationalistic, or uninformed. That's the hypocrisy at the heart of this global narrative game. They can criticize India all they want, but when Indian media dares to question them, it becomes propaganda. When Western journalists attack, it's called freedom of expression. But when Indian voices defend their nation, it's labeled hyper-nationalism. Maybe what truly bothers them isn't India's media, but India's confidence. Because for the first time in history, Indian journalism isn't asking for validation, it's challenging it. And maybe that's what really unsettles the West. Because in a world where trust in democracy is fading, India's democracy still stands unshaken, loud, chaotic, and beautifully alive.